It has been astonishing what's happened just in the past week, but you still have to ask who would be Prime Minister at the moment, because it seems that the challenges in his in-tray are just overwhelming.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's one thing after another, isn't it? And I think, with what we've had going on with questions over the Home Office and various other issues, this is maybe some kind of slight diversion away towards things that people are actually talking about on the streets. I think the thing with the COP27 snub is potentially a good move from him. People have been polling as suggesting that net zero is certainly not number one on their list of priorities. And with what's happened recently in Sweden, I think there's a general move among a lot of voter bases to re-question whether or not the 2030 commitments are actually affecting taxpayers' bottom line unnecessarily, as we sort of export our carbon emissions rather than do away with them. Essentially, all we're doing is just importing back the same number of carbon emissions at a much higher price and a much higher cost to the taxpayer.
Oh, that all sounds very confusing, to be perfectly honest. But let's talk about this £50 billion black hole. We know that Rishi Sunak, when he went through all the hustings in the summer, he wants to balance the books, right? But that is going to mean spending cuts, and it is going to mean tax rises, which on the surface of it, of course, well, the spending cuts are sort of conservative. The tax rises certainly aren't.
Yeah. I think what he needs to be really looking at is how we boost some kind of growth, certainly for SMEs and small businesses, and how we can actually grow investment in this country instead of just landing the bill back on the taxpayer. Something needs to be looked into, certainly around corporation tax bandings, for instance. Now, with a massive hike up at the top end, surely that leaves some room for growth at the lower end. Bringing in maybe some kind of tax banding on corporation tax to influx a new level of growth in tech startups and in other startups. He needs to be showing activity to the business community rather than just trying to foot the bill back on the taxpayer.
It's interesting as well, isn't it, that there are reports that already Jeremy Hunt has met every living chancellor in the last, 30 or 40 years or so, including Kwasi Kwarteng, but going right back to George Osborne, who, of course, brought in what's the word?
Austerity.
No, thank you, austerity, which doesn't augur terribly well, does it? But clearly something's got to be done. Do you think there's any chance that we're going to see austerity again?
I think so. I mean, the reality is that with rising inflation, unless this government looks at massive cuts, we're not talking 50 billion, we're talking the greatest amount since World War II spending. Unless it finds something to counterbalance that with growth, then we're looking at...
How would that manifest itself? How would austerity now affect us?
I think that the first thing we'd start to see is obviously bills going up, which we've already started to see. But that's going to filter down into the way that businesses are run, because the reality is that for a lot of people, logistics will start to be an absolute nightmare, as we already saw through the pandemic. And I think the areas that the government needs to be looking at cutting spending in are certainly on commitments to green levies and constant what we would see as metropolitan formulas for people living out in the Red Wall, for instance, who just want to see their bills go down and don't want to pay, thousands and thousands on new boilers and electric cars as essentially fads for the next 15, 20 years. They're having to remodel a lifestyle while the government doesn't really listen to them and doesn't really realise that their pockets can't go that deep. So the government needs to get back in touch with ordinary people on this.